My name is Clara Whitmore, and the story I am about to tell is the story of the day my life quietly broke apart. For many years I lived in a small but warm house on Rosewood Street in Boston, America. It was a simple place with pale blue walls, white windows, and a little garden where my children liked to play. Every evening we sat together at our wooden dinner table. My daughter Lily laughed easily, my son Noah asked endless questions, and my husband Daniel Whitmore used to smile at us like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. I believed I had a normal and peaceful life. My older brother, Edward Hale, lived far away in London, Europe. He always liked to remind everyone that he was successful. He owned a large brick house on Kingston Avenue and worked in finance, managing accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. His wife, Victoria Hale, was quiet but elegant, the kind of woman who spoke softly but always seemed to be watching everything. My parents trusted Edward more than anyone. They often said he was the responsible one, the one who would take care of the family money and the family name. One summer, Edward and Victoria came to visit us in Boston. At first it felt like a happy family reunion. Victoria brought gifts for the children, and Edward talked about business opportunities and investments worth more than $200,000. Daniel seemed excited to spend time with him. They stayed up late talking in the living room while I cleaned the kitchen and prepared the house for the next day. But after a few days, something began to feel wrong. Daniel started coming home later than usual, and Victoria often disappeared for long walks around the neighborhood. Whenever I asked where she had been, she simply smiled and said she needed fresh air. I tried to ignore the strange feeling growing inside me, because sometimes the truth is the last thing you want to believe. The morning after Daniel disappeared, the house felt empty in a way I had never felt before. The kitchen chair where he used to sit looked strange without him there. His coffee cup was still on the counter, and his jacket was missing from the hallway. But the worst part was the silence. My children kept asking questions that I didn't know how to answer. Lily stood near the window looking down the street, hoping she would see her father coming back. Noah asked me 3 times that morning, "Mom, when will Dad come home?" I tried to stay calm for them, but inside my chest everything felt heavy and broken. Later that afternoon, I received a message from my brother Edward. He told me that Victoria had arrived in London and that we needed to talk about the situation. His message sounded serious but not kind. A week later he called again and told me I should come to London with the children. He said our parents were there and that the family needed to discuss the inheritance and our future. I felt nervous, but I also believed that my family would help me during such a painful time. I sold some of my jewelry and bought 3 plane tickets for about $1,300 so we could travel from Boston to London. When we arrived in London, the weather was cold and grey. Edward picked us up from the airport but barely spoke during the drive. His house on Kingston Avenue looked even larger than I remembered. Tall brick walls surrounded the property, and the windows shone brightly from inside. My parents, Margaret and Thomas Hale, were waiting in the living room when we entered. They hugged the children, but their smiles looked forced. Victoria was not there, and no one explained where she had gone. After dinner, Edward placed several documents on the large glass table in front of us. His voice was calm, almost cold, as he explained that our parents had already transferred the entire family inheritance into his control. The documents showed that the family property in New York, worth nearly $450,000, as well as several savings accounts, were now legally his responsibility. When I looked at the papers, I felt confused and shocked. I reminded him that the inheritance was always supposed to be shared between us. Edward leaned back in his chair and looked at me like I was a stranger. He said that after the scandal with Daniel leaving, the family believed I was not capable of managing money or property. My mother nodded quietly beside him, avoiding my eyes. My father stayed silent the entire time. I tried to explain that none of this was my fault, that Daniel and Victoria had betrayed me. But Edward simply waved his hand as if my words did not matter. He told me the decision had already been made and that the documents were finalized weeks ago. Then he stood up and walked toward the door. His voice became colder than I had ever heard before. He said that I could not stay in his house and that I needed to find somewhere else for me and the children. Lily started crying immediately, holding my arm tightly. Noah looked at his uncle in complete confusion, unable to understand why his own family would treat us this way. I begged Edward to let us stay just one night until we could figure out what to do, but he refused without hesitation. As we walked out of the house with our bags, Edward said something that cut deeper than anything else. He said that the family was tired of my problems and that maybe if I had chosen a better husband, none of this would have happened. My children heard every word. Their faces showed shock and shame, feelings that no child should ever experience. That night we checked into a small hotel near the train station. The room was narrow and the beds were old, but it cost $70 for the night and it was the only place we could afford. Lily cried quietly while Noah tried to comfort her. I sat near the window watching the rain fall over the streets of London. In that moment I realized that not only had my husband betrayed me, but my own family had abandoned me as well. I held my children close and promised myself that somehow we would survive, no matter how long it took. Years passed after that night in London, but the memory of it never truly left me. My children and I eventually returned to America and started over in a small apartment in Chicago. The building was old, the walls were thin, and the rent cost almost $900 every month, but it was the only place I could afford at the time. I worked long hours cleaning offices in the mornings and helping at a small cafe in the evenings. Every dollar mattered. Some days were exhausting, but I kept reminding myself that my children were watching me, and I had to stay strong for them. Lily slowly grew into a quiet but determined young woman. She helped me around the house and studied hard at school. Noah loved fixing things and often repaired small broken items in the apartment. Even though our life was simple, we found peace in our routine. We ate dinner together, laughed at small jokes, and slowly built a life that no one could take away from us again. I stopped thinking about my brother Edward and my parents. In my mind, that chapter of my life was closed. Then one afternoon, something unexpected arrived. It was a cloudy day when I came home from work. A small brown delivery box was sitting outside our apartment door. At first I thought it might be a mistake because there was no return address on the label. My name, however, was written clearly across the top. I carried the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table while Lily and Noah watched curiously. Inside the box were several strange items. There was a small flash drive, a thick envelope filled with old photographs, and a few bank documents. At the bottom of the box was a folded letter written in careful handwriting. When I opened the letter, my heart began to beat faster. The letter was from Victoria. She explained that after leaving with Daniel, their relationship slowly fell apart. Daniel had left her years earlier and disappeared somewhere in America. She wrote that she had been living alone in Paris, Europe, struggling with guilt for everything she had done. According to her letter, the truth had followed her everywhere, and she could no longer live with it. She said that the things inside the box were evidence of what really happened years ago. With shaking hands, I inserted the flash drive into my laptop. What I saw shocked me completely. The drive contained voice recordings, private messages, and financial files. Many of the recordings were conversations between Victoria and my brother Edward. In one recording, Edward's voice was clear and confident. He was telling Victoria that if my marriage collapsed, I would become weak and distracted. That would make it easier for him to move the inheritance into his own control without resistance. Another file contained documents showing money transfers from my parents' accounts into Edward's private business. The amounts were huge, nearly $300,000 moved quietly into investments under his name. There were also messages showing that my parents were aware of some of these transfers but chose to remain silent. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after seeing everything. Lily and Noah watched me carefully, sensing that something serious was happening. For years I had believed that my life fell apart because of betrayal and bad luck. But now I understood that it had been planned. My brother had used my pain as an opportunity to take everything. The humiliation, the loss of our home, the way we were thrown out in front of my children. It was not just cruelty. It was part of a larger plan to remove me from the inheritance and secure the money for himself. The small brown box sitting on my table contained more than memories. It contained the truth that had been hidden for years. For the first time since that terrible night in London, I felt something new growing inside me. It was not sadness. It was determination. I carefully closed the box and looked at my children. They deserved to know that the world could still be fair. And now, finally, I had the proof that could bring everything into the light. The night after I opened the box, I could barely sleep. The apartment was quiet, but my mind was full of thoughts. For years I had tried to forget my brother Edward and the humiliation we faced in London. I had worked hard to build a new life for my children in Chicago, and slowly we had found peace again. But the evidence inside that box had reopened everything. It showed that the pain my children and I suffered was not just the result of betrayal. It had been carefully planned by someone I once trusted more than anyone else. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. After dropping Lily and Noah at school, I traveled to New York, where I had scheduled a meeting with a lawyer named Michael Carter. His office was located in a tall glass building overlooking the busy streets of Manhattan. I remember feeling nervous as I walked into the building, holding the box tightly in my hands. For a moment, I wondered if it was better to leave the past buried. But then I remembered the way my children looked that night in London when we were forced out of Edward's house. That memory gave me the strength to walk forward. Michael Carter welcomed me into his office and asked me to explain everything from the beginning. For nearly 2 hours I told him my story. I described my life in Boston, the visit from Edward and Victoria, the moment Daniel disappeared, and the cruel night when my own family forced my children and me out of their house. Then I placed the box on his desk and showed him the evidence inside. He spent a long time reviewing the files from the flash drive. He listened to the recordings, studied the bank transfers, and read Victoria's letter carefully. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was serious but confident. He said that the recordings clearly showed Edward encouraging Victoria's relationship with Daniel as part of a plan to weaken my position in the family. The financial documents also suggested that Edward had transferred nearly $300,000 from my parents' accounts into his private business without proper authorization. According to Michael, this evidence could support multiple legal claims. We could challenge the inheritance transfer that had given Edward control of the family property in New York, which was worth almost $450,000. We could also pursue financial fraud charges related to the money that had been moved into his company accounts. Hearing those words felt strange. For years I had felt powerless, but now someone was telling me that the truth might finally be strong enough to fight back. Within a few weeks, Michael began filing legal actions in both New York and London. The evidence was submitted to the courts, and investigators began examining the financial records connected to Edward's business. At first I expected the process to take many years, but things moved faster than I imagined. The recordings from the flash drive created serious questions about how the inheritance had been handled. News of the case slowly began to spread. Edward's company had several investors who had trusted him with large amounts of money. When they learned that he was under investigation for financial misconduct, many of them became worried. Some withdrew their investments, while others demanded explanations. Banks started reviewing the company's accounts, and several of them temporarily froze transactions until the investigation was complete. During this time, my parents tried to contact me many times. My phone received message after message from them. My mother wrote that the situation had become very difficult and that the family needed to speak privately. My father sent short messages asking me to reconsider the legal action. But I remembered how they had sat silently while Edward forced us out of his house. I remembered the way my children cried that night. Because of that, I did not answer their calls. Several months later, the case reached a critical point. Victoria, who had sent me the box, was asked to give a formal statement to the court in London. She confirmed that Edward had known about her relationship with Daniel from the beginning. According to her testimony, Edward had even encouraged the situation, believing that if my marriage collapsed, I would be emotionally unstable and easier to remove from the inheritance decisions. Hearing this confirmation was painful, but it also proved that the evidence in the box was real. Financial investigators also discovered that several transfers from my parents' accounts had indeed been moved into Edward's private investment company. The total amount was close to $300,000, and many of the transactions had been hidden within complicated financial reports. These findings strengthened our case significantly. Eventually, the court delivered its decision. Edward was ordered to return the full value of the inheritance that had been unfairly transferred into his control. This included the property in New York and several financial accounts, bringing the total amount to approximately $450,000. In addition to that, the court required him to pay an extra $120,000 in damages for the financial harm caused by his actions. When I heard the final ruling, I did not feel the excitement I had expected. Instead, I felt a deep sense of calm. The money would certainly help secure my children's future, but the most important thing was that the truth had finally been recognized. For years people had treated me like a failure, like someone whose life collapsed because of her own mistakes. Now the truth showed that the story had always been much more complicated. Edward's reputation in the financial world quickly collapsed after the decision. Many of his investors left his company, and several partnerships were cancelled. The large house in London that once looked so impressive became a symbol of everything he had lost. My parents, who had once trusted him with the family's wealth, were now forced to face the consequences of their silence. One evening not long after the case ended, Lily and Noah sat with me in our apartment in Chicago. The sun was setting outside the window, and the room was filled with warm orange light. Lily asked me quietly whether I finally felt happy now that everything was finished. I thought about her question for a long moment before answering. Happiness is not the right word, I told her gently. For many years I had carried anger, sadness, and humiliation in my heart. The court's decision did not erase those memories, but it did something important. It showed my children that truth matters, even when it takes years to be heard. I just feel free now, I finally said. And for the first time since that terrible night in London, I truly meant it.